Buenos días. Es honor para mí para ayudar a ustedes en este trabajo importante. Pero si yo hablo español como un niño de 4 años, I'm going to spare you my Spanish and speak the rest in English. But I really compliment you on this very progressive, forward-leaning effort. When I worked for Secretary Clinton and began the Global Shale Gas Initiative, we hoped that we would reach out to governments and governments would look before they leap. They would think about the framework in advance of development so that people would be comfortable that the government was on top of these important issues that you've heard about this morning, seismicity and water management and other issues. So I really compliment you on what you're embarking on today. I'm going to talk about the outlook for demand. Come back here, go up to the beginning. And I'm going to make these points to you this morning. The outlook for demand for natural gas worldwide is really very strong. Unconventional gas is likely to provide 2/3 of the growth in natural gas till 2035. There obviously will be substantial growth in conventional natural gas. And if we do it right, it's likely that natural gas will take share from coal and from oil in power generation. And this has very positive impacts for the climate and has very positive impacts economically for the countries which produce this gas. But I'm going to show you statistics from 2 different agencies today. One is the International Energy Agency in Paris, which has produced this golden age of gas and golden rules of shale gas. And the other is the Energy Information Administration, EIA, which is a US statistical agency. And they're largely the same, but IEA, with apologies to the translators, because IEA and EIA are probably sound the same, but IEA has one projection for what it calls the golden age of gas, which essentially says that if we get the social and environmental and regulatory consequences right, we're going to see an enormous amount of gas production with very positive benefits. But if we get it wrong, it won't happen. We won't get that supply. The demand is not going to be there, and coal and oil will probably take that share. So a lot of the ability to reach this golden age depends on what we do on the issues that you all are talking about, on fracking and water and other issues. I also want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about global demand. I'm going to talk about the demand in the hemisphere. I'm going to talk about what's happened in the US because it's illustrative. And then if there's time, I'm going to give you a couple of words on why a lot of the projections that you hear right now are based on very preliminary data, and we should take them all with a bit of a grain of salt. This is from the EIA's International Energy Outlook, and it shows till 2035 that we are likely to see an enormous increase in energy demand across the spectrum, but the fastest growth is likely to be in gas. This is from the IEA, the golden age projection, and you see that under their estimates, gas becomes the #2 fuel in the world. So this is an enormous increase in projections right there, and you see in that green bar a huge amount of growth there. The demand for gas, as you all have probably heard, is largely in the developing world and in Asia in particular. So you see enormous growth in China, in developing Asia, the Middle East also, where you're seeing for electrification and air conditioning and other issues, enormous growth, and then the rest of the OECD. So the demand markets are largely in Asia. Asia is a significant LNG versus piped gas importer, so that provides a great opportunity for those who are in the LNG world. In terms of the supply growth, this is in the Golden Rules case, and you see that, that 2/3 of this growth in total gas is coming from tight gas, shale gas, coal bed methane, the so-called unconventional sources, and the rest is from conventional. This is Russia and Qatar. This is the US, Canada, Australia, Colombia, and others in shale gas. So strategically, we're talking about a world where the countries which have open investment frameworks are seeing enormous investment in growth in gas production, and the reliability of global gas supply will depend to some extent on whether the frameworks exist in these other countries to produce that other gas. The projections for gas supply are broken down here a bit more. So you see the Middle East and North Africa, Russia, and then here the other countries that I've talked about. You don't see Latin America on there right now. And I think the only projections I'll show you in a little bit show gas production from Brazil, and they show it from a bit from Argentina. But that's because the projections are based on resource models. So they say there's a lot of resource, and they make an assumption about whether or not that resource is going to be produced, and then they plug that into the model. So that's a rational basis for making a projection, but those of you who live in the neighborhood know that it's not necessarily a very likely projection of what's going to happen. And so I think you'll see these numbers change, no disparagement meant to Colombia and others, but until you drill, until there's a proven resource, until people see the productivity, you don't show up in the statistics. And that's why these are really quite preliminary. This graph shows unconventional gas production, and the dots here show you what the share is of unconventional in total production. So you see the United States going to 2035, where we're going to get a very high percentage of our gas is going to come from unconventional sources. China is predicted to have a very high share as well, but you see it's got shale, it's got coal bed methane, and it's got some tight gas. Canada as well, and then you go down here. So again, another way of showing that, that the unconventionals are really very much leading the future supply. So what's happening in the hemisphere? Well, this is a projection for natural gas supply for Latin America, and you see, not unexpectedly, the so-called northern producers. Here we're talking about, I think they classify those as Trinidad and Tobago, and Brazil for Brazil is here, and Argentina. So these projections are showing pretty much a flat line from existing statistics on production, but there are real questions here about framework. So they're showing a dramatic increase in gas production from Venezuela. Question of whether gas production from Venezuela is really likely to reach the international market will depend on significant changes in politics, which we've yet to see. So these are preliminary, but you see that's where the global estimates are coming from. Oops. In terms of consumption, when you show the growth by region, I think it's important to recognize, especially as a potential LNG producer, only 10% of the world's gas supply comes from LNG right now. 90% of it goes by pipe. And so when you look at where the demand centers are, the question is, can you reach those markets? And China is likely to see the greatest increase in LNG as a share, some piped gas, that'll be Turkmenistan and other places. But they show in the hemisphere that you're likely to see the largest growth in supply from local conventional supplies, a little bit more from unconventional, and a bit by pipe. So that's a big bet on unconventionals in the hemisphere. This projection shows you gas flows, and I think the real news here is that this chart used to look like a bunch of countries with arrows going to the United States. And that doesn't happen anymore because we're not going to need LNG. And so you're looking at potential LNG exports from the US to Europe, from Latin America to Europe. A lot of the African and Middle East is going to Asia, and then possibly Canadian LNG going to Asia as well. So I think why this is relevant is Colombia needs to think about, if you're going to do this development, if you're going to invest, if you're going to have this not only for domestic consumption but also for export, where's your market? Who are your competitors? Is this going to provide the kind of return that you're expecting? And I keep coming back to the preliminary nature of the projections. You look at this map right now and you'd say, well, Australia pretty much has the Asian market locked up, at least through 2020 or a little bit afterwards. But as you go into the 2020 to 2030 period, you get to questions like, who is the lowest cost producer? Who can get to market the fastest? What are the transportation distances between these markets? And what is the likelihood that the Argentinas or Venezuelas or Russias or Canadas of this world will actually produce? Or even at home, what is the likelihood that the US will have LNG exports? Very much a matter of political debate right now. The overall projections, this is again from the IEA, is that the hemisphere is going to produce more than it needs. So I think the only point here is that there is a significant export opportunity. And then in the trade balances, what's interesting here is that this is from EIA, they show that going out to 2035, you're still, despite increased production in Brazil and Argentina, they still expect them to be importers by 2035. The demand will be so high, and so you've got opportunities in the hemisphere and elsewhere. Talk a little bit, sorry, about the US experience. We've had very rapid growth in domestic gas production. The EIA, which is our statistical agency, has to rewrite its estimates pretty much every 6 months. Even when they're aggressive, they still get the projections wrong, and that's because the technology is moving so fast. We've had a decline in LNG imports. Domestic natural gas prices have gone from about $9 in 2008 to somewhere around $2.50, $3 an MCF now, starting to tick back up, but a real dramatic change. The improvements in the technology, which I'll show you very briefly for production and processing, have really been exponential. And now we're talking about having a very robust natural gas liquids market as well. This has been an economic boom. We're seeing a revival in manufacturing. It has helped our very weak economy revive, so it's really been quite transformational. This graph shows the enormous amount of growth. 2005, shale was nothing in terms of its share of the US market. Now you see this, how it's grown so fast, shale gas, tight gas, and others, but you're looking at enormous growth out to 2035. And we've applied the technology to oil as well, so you're seeing where we used to be, this is the conventional oil. Now we've had enormous growth in unconventional oil, so-called tight oil in the Bakken and the Williston Basin. And this is why you see all this talk about North American self-sufficiency, but we've gone from 200 to 400 to 800,000 barrels a day pretty quickly. We'll probably get to 1 million barrels a day next year. People think unconventional oil, tight oil, could go to 3 million barrels a day by 2020. So it's just phenomenal on the oil side as well as gas. We're looking to be a net exporter by 2022, and the debate in the US is whether we should keep it at home or whether we should export it. Because if we don't allow it to be exported, we'll artificially depress prices at home. And if we export it, maybe our prices will migrate to international prices. There's also the question of, can you sustain production without an export outlet? And the reality is that we're seeing a significant drop-off in drilling right now for dry gas. Gas has displaced coal in our economy. And I think for Colombia, this is a potential opportunity for you all too. Some of this has been a result of the recession, but a lot of our reduction in carbon emissions is from the substitution of gas for coal. We have had a 33% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. We are close to meeting our targets through effectively no government policy at all, purely by substitution, and we're looking at a major substitution in this going forward because gas is cost competitive with coal. So it's really phenomenal. The technology story is interesting. Who's keeping my time? I want to make sure I'm not doing well. Okay. It's been very interesting. US rig counts have been down, but production is up. And that is because the companies have, by learning the shales over time, learned to identify the sweet spots. They have changed to multiple laterals, to multiple fracs, to longer laterals with multiple fracs. And so they've been able to reduce the number of rigs, reduce the environmental footprint, reduce their costs, and increase production. So it's a little bit miraculous, but you're seeing a tremendous progress there. And so this first slide shows you the drop-off in the natural gas rig count from 2009. Now it's ticking back up again, but that's the production curve. And I stole this from my friend Will Fleckenstein from Colorado School of Mines. But you see this is technology at work. And so it's really terrific from an efficiency point of view, but it's really more important from a community and an environmental point of view. Shrink the number of well pads, increase what you're doing subsurface, then you have less disruption above ground. I want to talk a little bit about these resource estimates because we've seen an awful lot of them. And the reality is that you don't know until you drill whether or not you've got a resource that's economically recoverable. What you see in a lot of the projections from EIA, which used a contractor called ARI to do its projections, and then you see projections from the US Geological Survey, you see people who look at what is the historical data. Maybe they're water wells, maybe there have been some early oil wells, and then they extrapolate from the productivity of those wells to what they know about shales in other parts of the world, and they make a guess about what the technically recoverable resource is. But whether or not anybody wants to continue to drill that resource depends on, number one, can you make money doing it? And that comes down to what does it cost to drill? How easily does the rock give up that gas? What is the cost of the completion? Can you sell that gas? What price can you sell it for? Can you access the infrastructure that you need? Can you access it in time, or do you have a time lag? And of course, do you have a license to operate? So it's a much more complicated question, and I'll show you some examples, but in Poland, you have seen huge variability in the estimates of the resource because one was a guess and one was based on a limited number of samples and another was based on improvements in the technology. So the estimates are bouncing up and down, but so is the investment. ExxonMobil has exited Poland because they didn't, it's not that they didn't find it technically recoverable, but they didn't find it economically recoverable. Talisman is looking for an exit. Others are looking in different shales and may get different results. In Argentina, obviously, you've got above ground issues. No one questions the size of the resource, but they question whether or not you can make money or get your money out of the country if you produce it. And in China, the question, there's a large resource there, but can you get the infrastructure? Can you protect your intellectual property? Can you own the resource after you sell it? And it turns out that the geology is really quite complicated. So very early days. This is the famous ARI map. EIA claims it, but it's really a contractor, very respectable folks, Velo Kustra and his team, who looked at all of the available data and made these projections, but they're really limited. And so a lot of the numbers that they came out with, 6,622 TCF, have come down dramatically, and they found 862 TCF in the US. And the IEA broke these estimates down in its golden rules, and this is where you see Russia's huge conventional resources. You see China expected to have huge amounts of shale, Saudi Arabia even having conventional gas, but these are all really based on very preliminary information. And so here, I took those top 10 shale gas producers, not the conventional ones, who are here on the left with the ARI numbers. So China, USA, Argentina, Mexico, huge. Where are they in terms of actually meeting the market? Well, China has one active well, and 8 are planned, and that one didn't go so well. The US, we have thousands of wells and thousands of rigs, so we can move pretty quickly. Argentina, you had the nationalization of YPF, some movement on price. Mexico has great resources, and they're thinking about shale, and I think they have $1 million or a $2 million plan to do some projects and look at it, but that's years away from production. South Africa just lifted its moratorium in September as they looked at the water impacts and looking in the Karoo Basin in a very dry area. Can we really access the water? Is there a way to do this? So they took a pause. Australia is going gangbusters, but has the most expensive LNG in the world. Canada is trying to figure out whether it can get an export outlet for that because the US doesn't need its gas anymore. So whether it's not going to produce it unless it can sell it. Libya has huge resources. They haven't done anything to look at them yet. Algeria and Brazil is in the planning stages. So these are the top 10 resource holders, but you only have a couple of them that are actually producing. And then you have other countries where Poland, you've got 25 wells, but it still remains to be seen how it's going to go. France is under a moratorium, even though they have a long history of oil and gas production. India is just figuring out how to do its leasing. Ukraine is doing studies and some contracting there. Hungary, you had some test wells, but it wasn't commercial. Romania, Bulgaria, under moratorium right now while the governments study what they want the policies to be. Tunisia, Germany, sorry, ExxonMobil, I mentioned that one. That's having some trouble there. So these are very early days where people figure out, do we want to do this and how are we going to do it? These I'll leave you really just for interest, but it's to show you that even our own estimates of our own resource based on data on drilling, which comes out every 6 months in the United States, because that's how often it's collected from the States, bounces up and down because here we decided, we had huge projections here, and then US Geological Survey came out and said, let's base our estimates on the actual well production that we've had. Even though the early wells didn't perform so well and the later wells have performed phenomenally, but we're the United States Geological Survey. We're just going to take a flat average and not going to weight it for technology. And so based on that, the undiscovered technically recoverable resources, not the ones that we have in place and know about, are a smaller number. And so this number came down. But the reality is, who knows? And this is a slide that just shows you recoverability and technology. And this is just to show you how over time, this is from 2006 to 2009, as the technology has changed with shorter laterals and longer laterals, the number of days it takes to drill a well has shrunk and the productivity has increased. So who you get, what technology they apply, how they apply it, how they figure out these shales, makes all the difference in economic recoverability. And this is kind of the glide path. First, you try and understand the geology. You have your test wells. Then you're going to apply the engineering and technology to what you learned about the geology. Then you're going to figure out, then you're going to go, sorry, to the economics and figure out whether what you find with the technology you have to apply is worth the investment. And then you go back and work on the geology some more. So this loop here is how people will figure out whether the resources are economically recoverable in Colombia. From an environmental point of view, the good news here is you have time, because they're going to drill test wells, and the number of wells that they're going to frack in the early years are probably going to be very few. So the magnitude of the water demand in the early stages is quite light, and they're going to figure out in this engineering and technology process what the drilling plan will be, what the water needs are going to be. They're going to get information about what's in the earth. You know, are there what we talked about, naturally occurring radioactive materials, and you'll be able to plan for what you're going to do with that water, how you'll recycle it, how you'll dispose of it. You'll be able to do some early measurements on seismicity. Are these faults critically active? Are you lubricating them or not? Before you have a large scale. So it's a learning process on both sides, but I think from a governance point of view, people need to understand, especially the citizens in the communities, that companies don't walk in and drill 30 wells, take a huge amount of water, and start re-injecting them. This is a gradual process, and so you've got some time to work with the community and figure out how this is going to go. I will leave this for your kit bag. This is just differences in the different estimates and why they vary so much, but it's very much apples and oranges, a lot of what you hear. And this is the up and down in Poland. This is the last slide that I'll show you. This was from Baker Hughes. It's on economically recoverable resources, and it shows you how much it costs and what the gas price is that you need in order to produce around the world. And so you've got the Marcellus, kind of the cheapest gas around the globe right now in terms of shale gas. So you're able to make money in the $4 to $5 range, and a lot of these are the U.S. basins. You get here where you're looking at Sweden and Europe and Poland, and the difficulty in accessing infrastructure and other issues make those costs much higher, but the gas price is higher there too. You know, it's $10 at the national balancing point. It's $18 in Asia. So it's a long way of saying that that whether or not things are economically recoverable here depend on a whole complex of factors. And if you see, these were the top shale plays. There are none in Latin America 2 years ago that were even estimated. So conclusions here, there is plenty of demand potential around the world. The supply estimates are going to vary a lot based on what happens when people are drilling, on geology, on technology, on policy, and on politics. The ability of any nation, the US, Canada, Colombia, to compete is going to depend on whether people accept the drilling, whether they think the government knows what it's doing, whether the rules are in place in advance, whether you have good geology, and whether you have global market conditions that justify that. I think the good news is 2 of the 3 are really 2 of the 4 factors here, which are the framework and the social acceptance are issues on which policy can have an impact. You can't do anything about the global market conditions, and you can't really do anything about the geology. You've got what you've got, but you can influence the other 2. And so, so I think what you do on these social acceptance issues will make a huge difference. And given the uncertainty in the rest of the world, I think you've got a very good chance if you produce well and you produce efficiently, and if you produce somewhat swiftly, that you can participate in this market. And a lot of the other producers who you're hearing about may or not be the suppliers who meet this increasing global demand. Thank you.